Imagine reading curated opinion pieces that aim to help us better understand policy and politics from the people closest to it, or sometimes people who want to be far from it. We offer political insights without the limit of column inches. Introducing Quotes by Air Quotes Media, creators of the Herle, Burley, and Curse of Politics podcasts, where we bring politics from the inside out. And now with Quotes, you can read from contributors like Jim Coyle, Jim Stanford, and Kathleen Wynne, with more to come. Read Quotes at airquotesmedia.com/quotes.
All right, you gorgeously miserable accursed. Your favorite perspicacious, profane political podcast is here. I'm David Herle, and with me, your ever-loving political panel, Scott Reid, Kory Teneycke, Jordan Leichnitz. Today on the show, we dive into this multi-billion-dollar Volkswagen deal. What kind of political battleground is it anyway? Defense spending. Apparently, we're not doing as much of it as we should. Is it possible to underestimate how little people care about this issue? We'll use our cursed clipping today, the Globe's piece on public support for federal employees' right to work from home, to kick off a discussion on the Peace Act strike. What are the politics here for the NDP in particular? And then it's the magnificent Gordon Pinsent with our Hey Yous. Jory, Scott, Kory, good weekend? How are you doing?
Doing well. I've got a man cold, so it's bad. It's bad. Lots of complaining going on here.
Oh, no. What are your symptoms?
Yeah, coughing, sore throat, you know. It's kind of like I assume like what women go through with childbirth, but a little bit worse.
Yeah. I think so. Did you get an epidural for that Kory?
Yeah, right at the base of my neck.
I spent the weekend. I spent a good portion of my weekend on a trampoline. And so just sit back and let that image soak in.
Don't want to do that.
No. It's my youngest. He turned 10 today. And on Saturday, we had 17 10-year-olds in the Bubble on Orphus Road. Yes, Orphus Road, which is both symbolic and literal. And they're bouncing around, and then an arcade, and then laser tag. And because he goes to an art school, all the children sing all the time.
All the children
as a
sing.
Group. All the children sing.
It's like a musical theater all the time.
It is like nonstop.
I like that
they do this. They go, and then they break into song, and it's like, and the people in the next party room are like coming over, going, "Could you tell your kids to fucking knock it off? My kid can't hear his own birthday. Okay, like it's weird. Like we don't want to hear any more aspects of love. Enough with like the Andrew Lloyd Webber, you weirdos." So it was greatly entertaining.
Jesus, Jordan, what are we here to talk about?
I forget. I was just deep in the whole of kid birthdays because my oldest went to his first he's a pandemic child, so he went to his first real birthday party this weekend, and they got to go and see a movie, the new Mario Kart movie in theater. And I tell you, there's no keeping kids on the farm after they've been to a movie theater and had like unlimited snacks. It's a real high bar.
Yeah.
Really, eh? They'd rather watch it. They liked watching it in the theater. I thought they'd rather be at home watching it on their fucking screen.
Well, I think that the aspect that he liked the most was that it was the unlimited snacks portion. Because that was not in his world prior to this party. So, so that was pretty fun.
Yeah, we know that New Democrats ration sugar.
That's no surprise. It's like the special period over here. It's really tight.
All right, so listen. We finally got the price for Volkswagen. Kory's been teasing us about this for weeks and weeks now, but we finally got the price for Volkswagen. $13 billion for a battery plant, 3,000 jobs. So I was watching, it's certainly something to discuss, but I was watching Kory and Scott on Question Period yesterday talk about the political fight about this, and I gotta say, I don't see it. What would Poilievre's angle be? I mean, you could whip up Western alienation about this. Here they are. They won't even let private sector money develop our industry, and they're pouring billions of dollars, government money into an Ontario industry. You could whip up that, but what's the point of that for him? What does he get out of that? You could argue it's a waste of money, but we know that nobody really cares about the debt and deficit. So where's he gonna go with that? I mean, this thing may someday end up to be a political problem because it's a boondoggle like cucumbers in Newfoundland. But at the moment, feels to me like it's pretty difficult to attack. Jordan, what do you think?
So I think that the Liberals have done a good job here making a virtue out of necessity, basically. There was really, Canada didn't have a lot of choice. If we want to be in the game on this stuff, there was going to have to be significant money ponied up. And so that's what they did. And they were able to attract this one particular investment, which is a huge one. But I think for the Conservatives, there is a temptation there to rail against this as corporate welfare. And I think also, for New Democrats, it's uncomfortable to see this amount of money being committed to a profitable private corporation. I don't think it sits particularly well for either of those parties. But for the Conservatives, there's no, like the New Democrats have kind of a clear path out, right? They talk about job guarantees, the quality of jobs, the proof is in the pudding, all of that stuff. So they have like a pretty clear path to say, we're skeptical, but, I think ultimately we're going to be supportive and we're going to see what happens for workers in the communities. But the Conservatives don't have quite such a clear path on that. And their rhetoric so far has been very critical. I don't know that it makes sense for Poilievre to go all the way to opposing this, because that's a pretty ugly piece to take into southwestern Ontario, to say that you're going to speak out against these particular jobs, which are actually not notional. These are jobs that are going to be coming in the very near future to specific ridings and specific communities where Conservatives may be competitive. So I don't think it makes sense for him to come out against it, but it also is a tricky one for them to support. And of course, the Conservatives themselves have some baggage on this. I think back to the auto bailout, very, very large sums of money. In fact, almost the same amount of money, although of course it was shares, which is.
But they took equity.
They did. They took equity, right? Although in the end, taxpayers, I believe they were on the hook for something like $4 billion. So it was fairly significant. And at the end of the day, though, what really mattered is that the Oshawa plant shuttered and those jobs left. And people do remember that. So I think that there's the danger for the Liberals on this is not necessarily so much in the sum of money, particularly because it is strung out over time in terms of production credits. It's really, do the jobs materialize? Do they stay? Does this actually end up becoming the cornerstone of a larger supply chain, which is the pitch, right? That this is just one piece in a much bigger puzzle. And if those things come to pass, then I think that this will be looked on, as a real coup and the start of something very positive. But if not, then there could be some significant weakness. But that's really for a future Liberal leader to deal with.
Scott, you think there's going to be a fight about this?
Well, I think the most obvious and most likely outcome is that Poilievre and the Conservatives will try to have their EV cake and eat it too. They'll criticize big spending and corporate welfare and wild-eyed investments by the Liberals. They'll drum up fears that the Liberals can't be trusted to, piss in a straight line and throw skepticism at it. But they'll stop short of saying that we shouldn't try to foster this brand new auto pack, this brand new sector. But I got to tell you, I wonder if we're all wrong. I genuinely, there's such a clutch of conventional wisdom, even as you've constructed it here, David, which is that this deal in abstract at this moment is unassailable. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that you couldn't. I'm not advocating for this. And I feel generally like governments kind of don't have a choice. We've decided we're committing ourselves to industrial policy. We've decided that this is going to try to build this thing in North America, and therefore we're going to have to compete dollar for dollar with Biden if we want to have it be north of the 49th. But I don't know that you couldn't attack this politically and have a lot of resonance. I don't know that you couldn't say, Jesus Christ, guys, this is one fucking plant. And then the next plant is going to be what? 7 billion? And the one after that's going to be 21 billion? How fucking many billions? And it's $43 million a job or whatever the math is, or $209 billion, overall. And does anybody believe that, government planners who gave you Churchill Falls and all these and cucumbers and, greenhouses, does anybody believe that these motherfuckers are going to be able to pull any of this off? Or do we all just think that you get fucked at the drive-thru if you're a genuine taxpayer? And so I think you could run it this hard. And I think there might be there are things you can say about this that make eminent sense to people. things that you could say.
Well, wait, what are you going to do instead, Scott? What are you going to, like, I mean, I think it would have to be, I'm going to do something instead. Because if your argument's just that I think the deficit should be lower, you're on a shitty side of that argument.
No. You don't argue with the deficit. I would never construct it that way. But if you wanted to run at this, you could say, why on earth is the government taking $13 billion in taxpayers' money and giving it to a rich private sector corporation that only, what feels like a couple years ago, was fucking you in the ass on environmental regulations and lying to people about diesel engines? So this is how we're going to run the world now? Come on. We're going to cut their taxes. We're going to make this a low tax environment, and we're not going to hand money in a bag to these guys. And I just think there might be a lot of head nodding to this. I think maybe you overestimate the obligation they would have and they would face in order to have, like, well, what's your alternative industrial strategy? Maybe they'll just say, kiss my ass. I don't have an industrial strategy. Cut taxes and let people do their jobs. And don't tell me that the United States is going to cut Canada out of this. There's already existing supply lines. It makes more sense to draw on the lines that are already on the trace paper. I don't know that I believe that, but I think that we're underestimating the potential power of that. And I don't think that Poilievre has made his mind up. I suspect he won't go that way. But by immediately saying I want to refer it to the budget office, the budget accountability office or whatever Christ it's called, do estimates, he's at least laying a little bit of track. It's probably trying to have his EV cake and eat it too, but he's maybe laying a little bit of track to take a run at it. You never know.
Yeah, it's a pretty soft pitch. I don't think you don't toss a letter to the PBO if you're going in for
I agree, but I just wouldn't be so sure that this thing is absolutely unassailable. We're talking about it like it's it's absolutely impregnable. I don't know.
We all understand the salience of what we read in an Auditor General's report, but how do you make the damn thing a must-listen-to document? The kind that spurs a response? Well, I happen to have a little personal history responding to Auditor General reports, hurly-burlyites, one in particular, so I'll take a crack. Last week, I mentioned the AG's report on the status of rural connectivity in Canada has just been released. I've said it before, and the data bears me out. Our presenting sponsor, Telus, has the strongest track record of bringing high-speed connectivity to our rural and Indigenous communities. One of the key recommendations in the report? That old bugaboo we've talked a lot about here. In order to meet the government's target of connecting 100% of Canadians by 2030, we need to use the spectrum. Well, Telus says huzzah to that. They're keen to work with government to deploy more spectrum and invest meaningfully in fixed wireless. The problem is, too many of their competitors are about as interested in that as I am in Elon's Twitter, which is to say, not a whit. Instead, they try to game the system. They squat on their spectrum, looking to resell it at some point in the distant future for immense profit. It's profits over people, because it leaves so many of our rural communities without any hope of high-speed connectivity today. And here's what makes the situation even more difficult to remedy. Right now, the whole thing is a black box. There's no way to see on a map or database which carriers are deploying their spectrum to provide meaningful coverage, and which aren't. Telus has long advocated for a use it or lose it policy on this, or at the very least, as the AG report suggests, share it or spare it. And their own Spectrum white paper released last fall aligns with the AG report in calling for transparent disclosure of coverage and spectrum use. Without these things working in tandem, hurly-burlyites, getting 100% of Canada connected by 2030, giving all our communities the digital tools they need to thrive, just won't be possible. Go to telus.com/rural to learn more. Kory, if I was the government, I think I would raise the rhetoric a little bit. I mean, econometrics is bullshit, and everybody knows that. It's going to create X number of jobs or X amount of economic activity. Those of us who've been in government know that there is no spending proposal ever made by anybody that actually costs the taxpayer money. They all, over time, pay themselves back and more, all of them.
Right.
So we're used to seeing such bullshit. So I don't believe the econometrics. But, this could be part of a big economic vision. I mean, I think Canadians feel we're lacking that. I think Canadians feel we're lacking an economic plan going forward. They're uncertain about what our plan for growth is. And this could be part of it. If the government sort of didn't fight about whether it's 3,000 jobs and whether that's a good metric, but said, hey, this is the future and we're going to be part of it.
Yeah, well, I think it is smart, and I don't think that Trudeau has to sell it alone. I think Ford will be standing next to him selling that, because it's more or less the same economic narrative that he got reelected on, and I think it has the added benefit of being true. That there are a lot of big things going on here, and I think that, not to play this game, and as somebody who believes in markets and is on the conservative side of the ledger, I've got a lot of discomfort with it. But I've also worked in private industry for long enough to know the reality of investment decisions made by global companies. And if you've got one jurisdiction next door to the market you're going to service that's offering you tens of billions of dollars of subsidies, and another that isn't, I know which one the plant's going to get built in, like 10 times out of 10. So, but I think you got to pull the lens back a little bit further still, because what this is really about is China. This is really about critical minerals. This is really about who's going to be the dominant force in batteries and EVs and in electrification. And it's going to be Team North America versus Team China here, and so
that's a compelling story, Kory. That's a compelling political story.
Well, but as I say, it is that a benefit of being true. Like, this is what's going on. This is what the Biden trip was about. This is what the industrial policy that's being pursued both in Ontario by the provincial government and the federal government is focused on. And so you're seeing a reindustrialization of southwestern Ontario. Anyone who opposes that does not have a political future in southwestern Ontario. There may be buyers for those messages that Scott laid out in other parts of the country. I don't doubt that. But there aren't any buyers for that message in southwestern Ontario. And good fucking luck getting elected as a majority government in Canada without significant support in southwestern Ontario. I just don't think the math works. So,
hey Kory, speaking of the hard politics of it, how do you feel about Trudeau's deliberate wedge between the federal and provincial arms of conservatism in Ontario in the announcement? How he went specifically at Ford supports us, Poilievre opposes us. Ford and Poilievre are not the same party.
Well, we did a similar thing in the provincial election, wedging Del Duca and Trudeau, but wedging you can like Trudeau, but Del Duca isn't the same guy. So I think it's just a mirror of the same play that Ford was running in the provincial election, and it makes sense. And it makes sense for this reason. The two leaders share a fifth of the same electorate. So 1 in 5 Ford voters voted for Trudeau. 1 in 5 Trudeau voters voted for Ford. And this is not an uncommon dynamic. Like, this was true if you go back to Harper and McGuinty, or if you go back to Trudeau and Mike Harris.
Winners tend to overlap, right?
Yeah, they tend to overlap, but they overlap with those same swing voters, those shoulder voters that you see mostly in the GTA and in the 905 area code. But they're also in southwestern Ontario, and I think the challenge for Poilievre is to try to recreate something that looks a lot like the Ford coalition, voter coalition, and it's hard to do that without getting union support. There's lots of signs that he's making inroads there. I think that's all very positive for him. But that's some of that has been more focused on the building trades. You really need to get into the uniform members as well, the auto workers, etc. And these sorts of announcements speak really strongly to that support base. So, I don't see a way where Poilievre can do anything more than nitpick on the sidelines. As for the driving a wedge, look, it makes a lot of conservatives, including myself, uncomfortable when that happens, because I support Ford and I support Poilievre, and that's true of many conservatives. I'd say overwhelmingly conservatives, but it's not true for all people who voted for the Conservative Party provincially, and those are the people that Trudeau's aiming at. I don't think he's going to drive a wedge in between Poilievre and Ford supporters like myself, or people who donate or reliably vote Conservative. I don't think he's trying to do that. I think he's trying to wedge away the ones that only sometimes vote Conservative, and he may have a good opportunity to do that.
But Scott, I don't believe Kory. I don't believe Kory because I think it's a tremendous.
Look at the jacket.
No, almost never.
How can you believe that? The jacket. I feel like he's going to sell me a car in a minute.
As opposed to a Rod Stewart T-shirt, you believe anything a guy in a Rod Stewart T-shirt tells you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw one of those brown cardboard Amazon boxes sitting on somebody's porch the other day, and it got me to thinking. Doorstep delivery is something we now take for granted, without giving much thought to what lies behind it. We've become used to pressing send and expecting the brown cardboard box to appear out of thin air. Well, the fact is that a long, efficient, well-oiled supply chain lies behind that cardboard box. The courier that delivered it is just the last link. It emerged from a distribution and shipping system so impressively integrated, it can swing into action and work overnight, often dropping the box on your doorstep the next day. But follow any box, any delivery, back far enough, and you'll probably find it journeyed on a train as cargo. If it was manufactured abroad, it likely came to Canada on a ship and was then transferred to a train. If it was made in Canada, it went from the factory by truck to a train. If the merchandise in your cardboard box is food, say something made of grain, it originally traveled vast distances in a hopper car. If you've got it, chances are a train brought it. All of which is to say that the reliability of your doorstep delivery and its competitive price rely in large part on smooth, efficient cargo transport by rail. Our sponsor, CN, is deeply invested in keeping that supply chain humming. But it is concerned about the federal government's plan to impose something called extended interswitching. As I said here last week, that plan would force railways to deliver cargo to each other, back and forth, perhaps multiple times, from origin to delivery. It would, without question, delay cargo and certainly increase costs, and costs are inevitably passed along to consumers. The government says extended interswitching will make supply chains faster and more resilient. In fact, it will do neither. But it will almost certainly have an effect on the time it takes for that cardboard box to arrive and on its price. If extended interswitching goes ahead, you may not like the result. So
can I just throw a quick thing in?
Wait. I got a thing.
Oh, God. All right. You and your thing.
I've got a thing. My thing is to respond to what Kory just said. I don't believe that because I think that it is a tremendous advantage for Trudeau in an election in which they're trying to portray Poilievre as extreme or outside of the mainstream, to be able to triangulate him against Doug Ford, the Conservative Premier of Ontario. And if Doug Ford is a willing participant in that triangulation, surely that's going to create tension inside the party.
Yeah, no.
Sure.
Kory just spread beautiful tasting frosting all over it, but that cake is...
That is a shit cake, Kory, but it was very nice frosting.
I don't know. Maybe I didn't explain myself properly because I agree it creates tension. I think I said it did. Of course it creates tension, but like I think that the aim though is for the voters that are occasionally that switch back and forth. Like that's who's compelled by it. I don't think it changes the votes of longtime conservatives such as myself, but I do think it has an influence in the same way it did for us in the provincial election. I thought it was a very effective play for us provincially, and I think it will be for Trudeau federally. It's a good play. Why wouldn't you run it?
At minimum, one big takeaway is he was as ginned up and full of piss and vinegar as you've seen Trudeau in a long time at that news conference, right? You said, Dave, well, they've got to go out and make this argument. I don't know, to be fair to the Prime Minister, I thought he was making the argument pretty hard. It was a pretty full-throated endorsement. We're only, 3-4 weeks past since the Biden visit.
I just want them to get away from the econometric shit, because I don't think that's persuasive.
I agree with all that stuff. And, and then you have Champagne grabbing the microphone and explaining, George C. Chickenhawk, we have very good guarantees. We're going to be. And it's like, fuck off. It's not going to work.
Look, I was tough on Michael Cooper and his presentation last week, but dear God, Champagne, oh my God, take the microphone away from that guy.
I do think
I dare anyone to listen to him for 10 minutes and not need to put earplugs in. The guy is terrible.
But can I just say, I want to say this first, Jordan, because I want to get your reaction to it also. aren't you guys even just a little bit worried? Like, I am for this. I am for this industrial policy. People who listen to the pod know I've been arguing about this. I've been complaining that the likes of Freeland and Trudeau haven't been talking about this stuff in the past. But like, there's 2 years to the next election. There's a lot of balls that Volkswagen and others could drop between then and now that make this thing look different by the time we go to the polls. And I just like, if all four of us here on the Hollywood Squares are in agreement, and the editorial page of the Toronto Star, and the editorial page of the Globe and Mail, doesn't that make you feel just a little bit worried that maybe we're all missing something? It just feels like there's actually only one opinion that people are allowed to have on this. And I don't know. I think you could run a rail on this thing maybe.
There is a very obvious way that it doesn't happen, and there is a very obvious risk for this government. We've talked about it before. All of these investments are hinged on one thing: that the heavy component of these EVs is the battery.
Yeah, is the battery.
It's going to be close to where the critical minerals are mined, and the way to have none of these things happen is to not get approval on building the mines, like the Ring of Fire. And right now you've got I think a mentally unhinged, ideological wrecking ball named Stephen Guilbeault, who is in charge of environmental assessments. And I think he's not I don't think he's on the same team as the rest of the federal cabinet.
Wouldn't it be
I think Kory's right
running
about
an independent operation.
This is a gamble because it's very possible that the mining part of the supply chain never materializes. And if that's the case, in 2 years, then I do think things look different. But the other thing I want to say is, because we've spent a lot of time beating up the Liberals about lack of narrative, about failure to sell their industrial policy coming out of their budget, and so on and so forth. And here I think that they actually did it. The Prime Minister did show energy. He showed engagement. They've got something concrete here. These are actual jobs in an actual place. And one of the biggest challenges that we've had in Canada, and I say this like in the left more broadly, when we talk about moving to a clean energy economy and all that kind of stuff, is that it's all notional for people, right? There was no people didn't know what that job looked like, or there was no sense that that job was going to be there for them at any time within the immediate future that they could plan on or that they could even think about. And here we have an example. We've got a place, we've got a plant, and people know that that's coming for them now. And I actually think that the power of that is quite significant. If the other pieces fall into place, and if Volkswagen doesn't drop any balls on this over the next couple of years, I think that a proof point on the industrial policy in southwestern Ontario, where the need is so acute for this stuff, is actually really critical for a government, particularly this government that has been so painfully in search of a narrative. I think the gamble could really pay off for them.
I agree with that.
Scott, I only see it possibly flaring if it's a choice. If somebody came along and said, $13 billion is a fucking eye-watering amount of money, and instead of giving it to Volkswagen, I'm going to make sure every Canadian has a private primary care physician. Then you've got to fight about something. Yeah. But if you just say, oh, don't do that, it's a waste of money, I don't think you got to fight.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't build out a whole message map on this thing, but sure, that's what you would say. Look, I'm going to take that money and I'm going to invest it in long-term care, and we're actually going to build a place where we can.
The beauty of this government is you don't have to choose.
I'm just saying. Like,
so you think that the Conservatives are going to say we're not going to fund this?
No, they don't have that option. They don't have that.
Not if they're in their right mind.
Funding. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Oh, they might go.
We'll wait for that to happen.
I don't know.
But I hope.
They did in Nova Scotia. They said let's talk.
For the New Democrats, I very much hope that Poilievre does find some way to oppose this, because I think it's a great wedge, not just for the Liberals, but for the New Democrats with working people. So I hope he takes the bait.
Some of those Southwest ridings that we can't win that maybe you can win, you mean?
Let's do it.
Well, that's who you're competing with in southwestern Ontario as a Conservative. You're competing with NDP more than you are the Liberals today. And look, Ford won a a huge swath of those seats, including 2 of the 3 in Windsor. The next one that's coming down the tracks, though, is Stellantis, which is an even bigger deal.
So then more billions.
And then we know what number they put aside in the budget. It was $25 billion for this stuff, and that's basically one additional project. You might even see another one come down the tracks at some point, because there's, I believe there's Hyundai and Toyota and GM all sort of in the wings talking about doing additional things. So
there'll be one in Quebec at $100.
Yeah. I think we also, we can't forget in this conversation that the Conservatives are not allergic to attracting business with vast sums of money. It just comes in the forms of no strings attached tax cuts, right? So there's a vulnerability there when they're going to be pushed for their own investment plan on this.
All right,
you'll get exactly 0 companies coming in with a tax reduction only strategy.
And it will cost.
Listen, I'm for this policy-wise. I'm for this politically. I'm just telling you guys, I think when people wander around and say, Jeepers Creepers, Mike Tyson can never be knocked out, part of my antenna starts to tingle.
I always think about Adrian Dixon. Yeah. This man could kick a dog and win the election. Right on the
Guilbeault's the obvious way to fuck it up, and he seems to be hell bent on doing that in a number of areas. So let's see what happens.
What if you were an uncritical mineral? Can you imagine how sad it must be?
Oh my God!
I'm not a critical. Are you? Are you magnesium? Are you lithium?
Mineral, or does that make you?
I'm just iron ore. Get the fuck out of here, iron ore. You're not welcome. It's a whole new clubhouse.
So these last couple of years, there was this thing we couldn't stop talking about. A thing that was materially affecting how we lived our lives. Supply chains. Come on, it was on your lips nearly every day. Today, that thing is inflation. The two are linked. Choked supply chains aren't the only cause of inflation, but they're a factor. The result? That sick feeling when we look at the price of fruit or fish or the cost of supplies to run our businesses. So we need to take advantage of every opportunity to stabilize our costs and create greater affordability for Canadians. One big opportunity is Roberts Bank Terminal 2, the new shipping container terminal proposed for the Port of Vancouver. We'd like to congratulate our sponsor, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, which put forward the right plan for building it. And just last week, the Government of Canada decided the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project can proceed. It's a critical link for Canada's supply chains because, 1, we desperately need more container capacity so our trade goods move as efficiently as possible, and 2, because it'll bring healthy competition to the Pacific Gateway. Competition, as you know, typically spurs competitive pricing. More choice, more terminal operators create more options for businesses to help lower the cost of the products Canadians rely on. Lower costs. How badly do we need that, eh? Not just now, but always. Why is the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority the one to do it? They have a proven track record of building sustainable infrastructure projects, and they're a trusted partner of government, business, and Indigenous groups and local communities to get the job done. All right, there's a public sector strike on. They've gone on strike, and Angus Reid did a poll about it, and Vanmala Subramaniam in the Globe and Mail wrote about the Angus Reid survey. And after finding out that almost 60% of people supported the public sector workers' right to work from home, and less than 40% opposed their right to work from home. And I don't know whether that's because people themselves want to work from home or whether people don't think it would make any difference whether public sector workers worked from home or not. But they support that. And then it goes on to say, the poll also found that more people, 48%, supported the union's proposed wage increase than opposed it, 40%. On the issue of wage premiums of an extra $2.50 an hour for night shifts and overtime, also a key union demand, 65% of those polled said they were in favor of the proposition, while 27% opposed it. The level of support for various union proposals differed significantly according to political party affiliation, the survey found. Support for their demands was much higher among those who'd previously voted for the NDP and the Liberals as opposed to past Conservative voters. For example, about 73% of NDP voters and 58% of Liberal voters supported the union's annual wage demand, while just 30% of Conservative voters were in favor of it. But 30% of Conservative voters. So, Jordan, kick us off. Where does this put the NDP in their agreement to support the government? The union is angrily accusing the government of not negotiating in good faith, of delaying tactics, of stalling, of not really being at the table. The public supports the union by the sounds of it. But this is not an issue
fairness,
where
I'm not sure Mona Fortier
is
covered herself in glory this weekend either, with the apparent inability to return phone calls. Which
okay, well, take it over. Like, what's the politics of this from the NDP, and how much pressure are they going to be on to pressure the government?
Yeah, I don't think the politics for the NDP are that complicated on this, and that is reflected with the rapidity with which Singh was out saying that they will not support back to work legislation, and they will not support it even if it's a confidence measure. And that was something in the early discussions on the confidence and supply agreement that New Democrats were always very clear on with the Liberals. So that's, from the government's perspective, that's a known, and I don't think that there's any surprises there. The politics for the NDP are pretty clear. This is an opportunity for Singh to be seen, to be out full-throated in support of labor rights. And as that poll indicated, I think it's one where Canadians, for the moment at least, have some empathy for these workers. And I think it's important to remember, too, like we're not talking about extremely well-paid executives within the public service. We're talking about people who are overwhelmingly like in administrative positions, are making $40,000 to $65,000 a year.
That's not who people think of when they think of a bureaucrat.
Right, well,
they think of a white-collar worker.
Sure. Mm-hmm. But all that being equal, then I think that those polling numbers are even more persuasive, because if that's what, if people think that about civil servants and they're still saying that there's validity to those wage demands, which I think, by the way, there is, like these are really, when you look at wage growth and cost of living, like they're quite in line what they're asking for. But I think it also speaks to the moment that we're in right now. People all across the country in all sectors, private, public, everywhere, people are living paycheck to paycheck. They're feeling the squeeze. And so there is more empathy for workers, particularly in the lower end of the income spectrum, asking for increases to keep pace with the cost of living. And the federal government is the largest employer in Canada. So if they cannot provide those increases for their lowest paid workers, then all workers across the country have a big problem. And I think that New Democrats have an opportunity to drive that message, that these gains are gains, which I think that they will get eventually through this process. These are going to be gains not just for members of PSAC, but it does set a benchmark for other public sector unions across the country, which is why the provinces are watching this with such concern in some cases. And it also is a benchmark for
and the Bank of Canada.
Private. Sure. Well, and we can talk more about the Bank of Canada, and I think we should, because the Bank of Canada has, in my view, and in the view of many economists, gone unfairly after wage growth as being what's contributory to inflation. That does not actually appear to be the case when you dive into the numbers. And at the end of the day, I think it's a loser argument to say to people that, I'm sorry, in the wake of, the highest inflation that you can remember in your lifetime, we think that your paycheck should be the thing to shrink in order to tackle that problem. That coupled with the really aggressive interest rate hikes where people are feeling the pinch on their mortgages, like that's deadly. That's deadly. So for me, the politics that I'm most interested in this particular fight is actually the position of Poilievre and the Conservatives. They could not scurry away from mics fast enough last week on this, particularly on the question of back to work legislation, and they seem to have found themselves a position of strategic ambivalence on what they would do if it comes down to it. So I think that that's going to be really interesting, because you can't court the labor vote only by courting private sector unions, because people want to know what you're going to do when comes down to brass tacks. Are you going to be out there pushing back to work legislation? And that matters.
Hey, Kory, do you remember the York University strike in 2018?
Nope.
Just blanked it out here.
Wait a second. You were a TA, weren't you? I thought you had money on the line there.
I don't pay attention to what happens at that Marxist theme park in north of Toronto.
Some New Democrats think they lost the 2018 election over the issue of back-to-work legislation, and particularly back-to-work legislation at York University. It wouldn't be popular right now, but at a certain point in time, when their services are damaged or affected in some way, Jordan, people come around to supporting back-to-work legislation.
Perhaps, but I also think that we're not where we are in 2018, right? Like the economic situation is fundamentally different. There is a lot more labor unrest all across the country and actually globally, if you look at it. And there is a lot more public support now for these it is on the face of it, a fair argument. People feel that your paycheck should keep up with inflation. And I think it's a very difficult political argument to go no holds barred, to the mats against that right now in this climate. And so I think that really the equation has shifted. And the fact that you're even seeing the Conservatives reluctant to tiptoe into a back to work legislation debate signals that.
Well, I think there's a number of different things that are interesting about this, but a lot of them are touched on by these wage negotiations. The fact that there's the most support on their measures is around being able to work from home. I think that's interesting, and that is a reflection not on what people's view of the public servants are, but rather their own job position and what they would like to see happen in their own workplace. And I think there's a really good reason for that. The studies on how much additional income you were able to sort of save if you didn't have to go into work during the pandemic was considerable. You're not having to pay for a daily commute. You're not having to buy a lunch at work or do whatever. There's it's pretty hard to leave the house. And go to work.
It also saves money for the federal government, right?
Right. Well, all of those little businesses downtown that suffered it during the pandemic. Well, people were spending a lot of their paycheck every week in those places. So, I think people got a very large virtual raise if they were able to work remotely during the pandemic, and they want to hold on to those gains. And I think that. I think there's a message in there for political parties and governments and employers, especially in a labor market that's this tight, as to what it is that the white collar workers are looking for, and it's flexibility in their workplace. There are challenges in doing that. There's some questions around productivity levels, et cetera, et cetera. I think for the public sector generally, I'm less focused on wage growth, and I think the arguments that Jordan makes around keeping pace with inflation are persuasive to most people. What I think is left out of the equation is the amount of growth in jobs in the public sector through the pandemic was quite jarring. It's quite rapid. And, what did we get for all those additional positions? There's always, especially for any of us who've worked in government, a lot of skepticism around the public sector's ability to review programs, to reposition people from priority areas to priority areas from less priority areas. The public sector has a very bad track record when it comes to efficiency and it comes to having people working where they should be working in terms of priorities of the government and the public.
Well, I think those folks delivered services during the pandemic, and the proof's in the pudding, they got that out the door. They did that.
Private industry reorganizes itself almost continually, and government at the point of a gun. And very occasionally, and this is why program reviews are such a sham. Because they virtually never happen in a meaningful way, and it's not because government is somehow so special that it only allocates resources and human capital at priority areas and it never needs to reevaluate them.
I want to come back to that, but I know Scott's got things to say.
So, Scott, I want to just kick you off, Scott, if I could. So, the poll says the public's behind the workers. It's difficult to believe that the requests of the union cross a fiscal line for this government, because what does? Where would you find that such a line? So why is the government holding out? Why haven't they settled with these people? What is the government trying to prove here?
Oh, I think this is inside voice, outside voice. I think the inside voice of, listen, we've got to support the Bank of Canada and we're a responsible government, brought to you by the same people that wanted to present the federal budget as an exercise in fiscal restraint. They're trying to tell themselves within government that they've got to hold the line here. They can't contribute to rising wage settlements because that will undermine the good work of the Bank of Canada, which, by the way, maybe probably differently than Jordan, I think we're starting to look like we've got the ingredients for a pretty cushy soft landing. So I think maybe you got to give a nod of the cap to them. But I think it's that, which is kind of hubris, which, by the way, is going to just melt away. I'd I'd have two warnings for the government. One, don't take this poll too seriously. I'm with Kory. I think that this poll tells you very little about what people think about the public sector workers. I think it tells you what they want for themselves. So I think that more people would like, I'd like a little bit more money. And I also would like to see somebody else fight the fight for remote work, because maybe that will benefit me and I'd kind of like to have that. So that doesn't mean that isn't people's sentiment, doesn't mean that people don't nod their head when they hear that. But I think that if you then go, well, oh my gosh, that means that they've got the hand in these negotiations, that doesn't necessarily mean what it means. And the second thing I would say, and Jordan hinted this real quick earlier, I've supported these negotiations in the past, labor negotiations between the government and public sector unions, or those with whom you have to settle in terms of like nurses, doctors, that kind of thing. And my caution would be this: don't get caught up in the personal shit. And it looked like Minister Fortier is getting caught up in the personal shit on the weekend. And here's what happens. Like a donkey like me who's sitting there, right, not part of the negotiating table, but watching it keenly and advising the minister, says, the fucking union, like, they present themselves, they're the heroes, but they jabbed us and they didn't actually show up and they didn't come back with their offer. And now they have the nerve to say that we didn't show up, and like, oh my God, okay, we're going to get you out there. We're going to tell this. And I'm going to like try to whisper to the ear of a journalist. If I can't get that, then we'll actually say it on the record and blah, blah, blah. And no one gives a frosted fuck. No one cares. So don't let a ugly, sometimes people bullshitting in public and trying to play the violins with the media and all. Don't let any of that stuff actually distract you from where your self-interest is as a government. Your self-interest is in getting a deal. I don't think this thing has gone on to a point where it's causing anybody any political harm. But as soon as it does, you either need to make a deal or pass back to work legislation. And you'll be supported publicly as a government with either choice. And so I think the outcome of this thing is going to be, just get a wage settlement. But weird human personal shit can get in the way of stuff like this, and don't let it. Minister Fortier, Treasury Board, don't let personal animus in and around that table take you away, distract you from what your own self-interest is, which is just get a fucking deal. Get a deal before people notice that they can't get their stuff done.
I watched Fortier's interview on Question Period. I thought she did all right.
Me too. I'm just saying, don't get distracted by it.
She took a little bit of a kickback at the union, but the clip from the union on the other side, the head of PSAC looked like he was completely fucking unhinged.
Don't respond to that stuff. That was my advice. Don't get distracted by that.
I agree.
The liberals have to be careful.
I thought she looked calm and like the adult in the room, which is not uncommon when you're dealing with public sector unions. The government is normally playing that role, but you know what? But what normally happens is they get negotiated, they get legislated back, and what the NDP wants to support or not support on that is apropos to nothing, in the sense that the Conservatives will support back to work legislation, in my view, and it's not because I have some insider knowledge. It's just normally that they would. And the Liberals have been as likely to legislate public sector workers back as the Conservatives. If you look at the historical record, the NDP have been very consistent in being opposed. And so, what do you think?
Which is really a minority opinion in the country.
Yeah, it is. And generally, I think Canadians are really in the middle of the fairway on this one. Generally speaking, they're okay with with strikes and with negotiation to some degree, but at a certain point, enough's enough, and public opinion will turn. I think the Liberals are being smart by being out there saying we're negotiating. Let the strike play itself out a little bit, and when the public turns on it, then you legislate them back. And,
I think legislating back would be such a mistake for this government. But I mean, to be from a partisan point of view, I hope it's one that they make, because I think that would be very, very productive for New Democrats. But look, I think Scott has given some really good advice here. The government, I don't think anybody actually believes that they're not going to settle. They should get to that place quickly. And the last thing I wanted to bring up was a little gem. A little shout out to NDP MP Gord Johns for his question on the order paper. I don't know if you guys saw this today. The Political Playbook covered it. But this is the same Liberal government who since 2015 has spent $1.1 billion at Deloitte for consultants, contracting out. So that's a nice little new figure there, considerably more than the money that went to McKinsey.
It's a very small battery plant. It's a battery plant.
It's just
about
like
this big.
But listen, this is like, this goes to the nut of the problem. Like this government has no problem splashing out money for consultants that are their buddies, that are entrenched in absolutely every department of government. They're like a rhizome. They get in there.
Whose buddies are Deloitte?
I think Deloitte's a critical mineral. Aren't you guys missing the?
They're probably their own slice of our GDP at this point. But listen, like, nobody believes that this government is not willing to spend money when it comes to the public sector. But where they spend it, they have chosen to spend it on consultants. They have chosen to spend it on forcing people back to work in offices that have rodent infestations and like don't have proper internet connections and like crap like that. They need to sort this shit out, make a deal, get back to the table, be serious, and don't send the signal to Canadian workers that you're ready to oppose people who just want to see their wages grow with the pace of inflation.
Jordan
Politics
sounds like a new Democrat today. Let's get her our brown jacket with patches on the elbow. I fucking love it.
Just a nice car hat, please. As long as I don't actually have to do car hat shit, you know.
You are all fired up today. It's awesome. Well, Hurly-Burlyites, this confession may surprise you coming from a professional pollster, but I hated math in school. It's not that I wasn't good at it. In fact, I had a natural aptitude for numbers. It's just that math didn't interest me. Could never see why I'd need it. Well, now I do. Because finding a solution to climate change is, at its core, a math problem. Look at it this way. We need to get our carbon dioxide emissions down as close to zero as possible, fast, while subtracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's the net zero equation, and it's a tough one. In fact, the math gets even harder when we consider how we're going to power all those electric cars we'll be driving and all the clean electricity we'll need to make things like green steel. Ontario's electricity system operator says we'll have to generate at least double our current electricity capacity if we hope to reach net zero. Think of it. That means massive amounts of new, clean electricity, from more wind and solar to hydrogen power and energy storage. The system operator also predicts we'll need more than double the amount of nuclear power as we're currently producing. Canadian-made CANDU nuclear reactors are an energy source that safely produce no greenhouse gases. And right now, those CANDU nuclear plants are already producing more than half of Ontario's electricity, all of it clean and dependable. Doubling that capacity is going to take a lot of planning. Our sponsors at the Nuclear Innovation Institute know you can't just flip a switch to meet that demand. Big energy projects require environmental assessments and a host of other studies to make sure they're done right. That takes time. We need to start that planning now, and nearly 60% of Canadians agree. My polling shows that Canadians across the country support governments doing the environmental groundwork now, so we have the option to add more nuclear power later. Getting ready now is an approach that makes sense, and Canadians are sensible. Because at the end of the day, getting to net zero is a math problem, and nuclear power is part of the answer. Just do the math. All right, our last topic for the day before we get to our Hey Yous is this big scandal. It's an outrage about Canada's defense spending. We made the front page of the Washington Post, and it wasn't for a worthwhile initiative. It was because apparently the Prime Minister has spilled the beans to what must have been a shocked group of NATO allies that Canada was not going to reach its 2% GDP target for defense spending, at which they must all have fainted upon hearing that. How is this even a story? I guess it's a story that we were in the leak of the security documents, but seriously, nobody cares about this, right? Like, I'm just going to say, I have never in my long life seen any political party run for office on a promise to spend more money on defense as one of their lead promises.
Well, not in our lifetime, but
no.
if you to go back when the last time when Europe was in a full scale war, like we're not in a full scale war, thank God, but where there's a major land war in Europe. That's 1945, and it sure as hell was a big priority then. So I do think it's changed a bit. I really enjoyed hearing Jason Kenney and Dick Fadden on QP talking about this. It was good to see Jason actually doing some media. It was very thoughtful.
But wait a second, I'm going to interrupt you. Kory, I'm going to interrupt you.
What Fadden said, just let me finish my thought, is that despite the fact that it isn't a big political thing, it's an important thing. And, and it's important in other areas. Like there's more things than just the ballot box. There's also your relations with with other countries.
Not on this show, there ain't.
No, I don't know. Kory, are you wrong?
Jesus Christ. Kory puts on a strawberry jacket and he starts talking like a stranger.
So, Kory, I'm going to tell you what we write on the whiteboard at the start of every campaign. Important does not equal useful.
Yeah, right. So look, it's not great politics. I'll concede that. That's just, I think, a statement of the obvious. But is it something that I think we're going to see more of? Yeah, I think we're going to hear it more from allies. And I do think the government is going to spend more money, and they've signaled that they're going to spend more money. And I don't think it matters whether it's the Conservatives that win the next election or whether the Liberals win the next election. They're both will be having to bite the bullet and spend more on defense and security, whether they want to or not. And so the politics be damned, it's going to happen. It might not get to 2%, but it's not going to be where it is today.
I love this letter. Jason Kenney, you mentioned him. He's one of 6 ministers, former defense or finance ministers, who signed this letter demanding that the government increase spending to 2% on defense. All of them from 3 different governments, none of whom even sniffed that number, right?
Thank you.
3 different governments.
Let's not forget that under Harper, the spending dropped about $2.5 billion annually.
Different global circumstances, right? But there are lots of problems at defense, and I think they're having huge trouble with recruitment. They've got what is it, like 16,000, some huge number of vacant spots right now. If they could get their arms around not sexually harassing people who join the forces, they might have an easier time of recruiting people, especially women. But there are lots of challenges there. But we're sending systems to Ukraine, like air defense systems, that we don't even have in our own military. So I think it's showing where there are a lot of gaps in the Western alliance. Whether the Western alliance wants to or not is really immaterial at a certain level. We're going to spend more on this stuff. We are, and the government's signaling it will. So politics be damned. I think all the parties are going to have to bite the bullet, so to speak.
But the politics are what they are, and Canadians assume that the United States will protect Canada against any enemies other than the United States, and there's nobody that can protect us against them if they decided to be our enemy. So it doesn't make any sense to Canadians that we would, and they know that we're not close to defending ourselves, and they know that spending $20 billion more wouldn't make us close to being able to defend ourselves. So it seems pointless to people.
I think the other thing to bear in mind, and Kory's touched on this, is that the problems with Canadian military and the readiness that we're seeing are a lot less to do with spending and far more to do with the personnel shortages, which Kory has talked about, a lot of the facets. And a lot of that goes down to internal culture and just really abysmal retention rates that the Canadian forces have. This is something we know about. We know the reasons for it. And there has just been very little impetus for change inside the military to grab that and deal with it. So until that's dealt with, that's going to be probably one of the largest barriers to readiness. And then the second thing is procurement. We've touched on this before, but our procurement process is a mess. We sole source, we politicize our timelines, our decades when they should be years. And this is a huge barrier in terms of our ability to be ready, particularly for multilateral missions where we need to be working with other allies. at the end of the day, I think we also have to contextualize this. Like within NATO, less than a third of NATO members meet the 2% target. So Canada is not by any means the only country in this boat. And they're just, even if there is frustration on that within the alliance and frustration from the Americans, although I'll point out that, of course, the person who has articulated frustration on this most is Trump, right? So if you have Trump as a Republican nominee in 2024, you're going to have, I think, a really different picture, because he has effectively run against NATO on the basis that countries like Canada are free riders. And I think that that's a very different type of consideration. Maybe Canadians become more concerned in that scenario. But really, Canada's not the only one here. We are contributing in Ukraine as we can at the moment, you know, and I think most Canadians want to see support for Ukraine. They want to see the ability of Canada to participate in missions where they see Canada as having a particular expertise and a particular chance of success. And then they also want the Canadian Armed Forces to be available to complete one of their missions, which is keeping Canadians safe at home. And frankly, that's where most Canadians are going to see the military nowadays. It's floods and forest fires and other sorts of domestic crises like that. But I think the focus would be far better placed on dealing with procurement and dealing with personnel, recruitment and retention, rather than on meeting an arbitrary target that we're not even close to. We would have to effectively double our budget.
There are some minimum things, though, that I think that have to be achieved, and where there is real pressure, and where it comes to play on other issues that we care about. So, and we saw it from Biden when he was here on his visit. Things like the redo of all the radar facilities that NORAD operates in the north, which isn't NATO. There's only two partners in NORAD. It's us in the United States, and the facilities are on our land. And so, there's a huge need to do that. It's a major employment opportunity for people in the far north, which is something that is of benefit to Canada. But we're going to have to do that. That's pushing $40 billion right there. So that's and the government's a lot allocated the money for it. So we're going to see that for sure, I think. But I think if we get to the point where this is becoming a major friction point with Germany, with the UK, with the United States, and it's causing problems for us in other areas, and Canadians clearly see a linkage between the two. And I agree with Jordan. It's more likely if in the unhappy world, if Trump were the president again, that it would be a stronger thing. But I think then you might see some additional political pressure within our domestic population. But there would have to be seen to be a clear linkage between us not doing that and things in other areas that have a more direct relationship to people's pocketbook.
As correct as you are, David, in your observation that actually push comes to shove, people don't support this, Canadians aren't there, and that's why governments haven't hit 2%, and it's why it isn't actually a dominant issue and hasn't been a dominant issue. As accurate as that is, it has the disadvantage of being an argument that lacks virtue, right? Because there is this argument. Well, just because things aren't popular, just because
welcome to my world, Scott. Welcome to my world.
But it's kind of like by that measure, if we only invested in those things that mattered, electorally, then we would never invest in Indigenous issues, as an example, right? But by the same token, it drives me bananas when I hear oh, we have to hit the 2% target, say people ponderously and thoughtfully. Also, internal trade barriers, and let's eliminate supply management. By the way, these ethanol subsidies are absolutely irrational. You get this clutch of this kind of bullshit conventional wisdom. It's like, great, we're going to have
it's a concentric circle around John Manley. John Manley's at the core of all of it.
Absolutely. And then people say John Manley's going to speak at the monk school tonight. He's going to run through this list of issues. People will get very emphatic. He'll also say, I think it's time for us to lower corporate income tax, even if it's unpopular. And then people will go home, that clutch of people, and they'll go, my God, if only we had leadership like that. The fucking debate that actually needs to occur is it isn't whether we're going to be spending more, because all governments, except with a handful of exceptions, when really been up against it, have invested more and an increasing amount. The question is our problem really, the political hypocrisy comes in where we say, well, we'd like to do all things, but not increase the funding, because that's an impossible political trade-off. So, I think it's got to be more like, is it the radar stations as Kory talks about? Like, what are our commitments? Because we're not going to meet 2%, that we can't promise to be everything to everybody and all that. And that's probably a discussion that within those circles you can't have. So we just stumble along, and we're going to continue to stumble along. And John Ibbitson will write, as he did today, that we need to have a mature conversation about defense spending in this country, because it's just gotten out of hand.
But
and you know what? That column was written 30 years ago, like, and on and on and on.
It's all going to be in the white paper.
In my experience, in my lifetime, and it doesn't include the Second World War, thank Christ, but in my lifetime, there has never been broad-based Canadian support for Canadians shooting anybody anywhere in the world. There has not been a conflict that Canadians supported Canada being involved in.
Well, all Canadians, but certainly there's been support for various missions. And
no, but like when Chrétien did the Iraq thing, it was courageous because it was going up against the Americans, and it was courageous because it was going up against all of massive elite opinion about the war. Yeah. But it was not courageous politically, because most Canadians supported his position overall.
Yeah, and that was self-apparent.
Yeah.
And
similarly, when we agreed to go into Kandahar,
from the Canadian mythology around our role in peacekeeping, which has really become vanishingly small at this stage. And I think Canadians think about an offensive and a peacekeeping role very differently.
We went into Kandahar. That was in defiance of public opinion. That was something we did because we made an open-eyed trade-off and said, notwithstanding the fact that actually people are not necessarily for this, we need to do this for trade-off reasons in terms of allies and so on and so forth. Partly influenced by the fact that we'd said no to Iraq, we'd said no to BMD, and as a G7 partner, we had to do we had to step up in some respect.
Right. I haven't seen recent numbers on the conflict in Ukraine, but I'd be surprised if a majority of Canadians don't support our involvement there, as limited as it is.
But in that limited fashion, if you said to people, you know weapons. What? Yeah, like it's... we're going to have to actually put boots on ground. People are like, not my son. But forget it.
But when you have a tiny military and not a lot of weapons, then you're going to send some. You got to buy some more. And
Kory,
I think that's what's going.
Come on.
Yeah, right.
Anyway.
Yeah, we're sending
non-lethal. We continually send them non-lethal things. Don't they need lethal things?
They do, and we sent them 8 of our 88. They sent 8 of our 88 tanks, right? And what I find most fascinating is that it isn't 8 out of 88, because we haven't paid to maintain the tanks that we have. So God knows what number are actually functional and able to be deployed, and that seems like a really big waste of money, that you spend billions of dollars on tanks and then you don't pay for the maintenance, so they don't work anymore. And we saw that happen with our F-18 fleet as well. So the worst of all worlds is you buy a bunch of shit and then you let it rust out because you haven't paid to hire the staff to maintain it, which comes
these new
back
electric
to
tanks or something,
issues.
eh? You don't hear them coming. The electric tanks sneak right up on you. Like, holy fuck, it's a tank.
We're going to review General Dynamics. It'll be great.
All right, team. My Apple Watch tells me it's time for me to stand again. It doesn't think I'm standing enough. So we got to wrap this up.
We didn't get your heart rate going enough?
David Thrombosis Herle.
All right. Mr. Pinsent will bring in the Hey Yous for us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, who's going first?
Well, I'll go first this time. I want to do a hey you to Sean Fraser, and a shout out to you, David, and the Hurley Burley. I really, really enjoyed the interview with Sean Fraser that you did. And I guess the biggest reason is I really hadn't paid any attention to the guy, to be honest. And I thought he was very thoughtful and articulate. Obviously, there are a bunch of things that he said that I didn't agree with, but I found it very interesting. And I thought, within that portfolio, and I think this is a really great thing about Canada. There is a very broad consensus around immigration issues in Canada, which I think is an enormous advantage for us as a nation. But it was encouraging to me to hear somebody talk about skill shortages and the way to do immigration that maintains that consensus and public support. And I think it's the biggest throttle on economic growth in Canada right now, in basically every region. We need more workers. We need more workers if we want to enjoy have our parents and others enjoy the kind of retirement that we want them to have. We need to have more people working in our economy, and there's a good way of doing it and a bad way of doing it. And it made me feel good to hear somebody who was articulating that in a thoughtful way and in a way that I think enjoys broad-based support from Canadians.
Awesome. Thanks for the shout out for the Herle.
It's amazing how many cabinet ministers come on the Herle Burley, come on your podcast, David, and reveal themselves to be interesting, thoughtful, humorous people. And you're like, have they hid them under a stone in Ottawa? Like there's no.
It takes an hour to peel back the onion,
9 years on, and you would never guess that any of them have personalities. And
no. This guy's got game. And but I do think the government needs to worry about the nexus between immigration and housing. I think if anything's going to undercut support for immigration, it's going to be that.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Right. Jordan, Scott, who's up?
I'll go. Mine is brief. My hey you is going out to Prime Minister Trudeau. So I know this is last week's story, but we didn't talk about it, so I feel obligated to vent on it. This is about the Jamaica vacation. Prime Minister, you're absolutely allowed to have vacations. Everybody deserves a vacation. But you have to consider the optics of these, and simply clearing them through the ethics commissioner does absolutely nothing for your political problem. But I have a second hey you, and it goes out to whoever in the PMO leaked to CBC about the advice that was given within the PMO against the trip.
Go fuck yourself.
It's a shitty thing to do. You're right, but you don't get to be right in public. When you're in the PMO, that is not the gig. So the hey you is out to the Prime Minister, but really more out to whoever leaked that. It's whiny. Don't do it.
Yeah, no. You look smart to that. You look smart to that one journalist. Yeah.
Never brief against your boss. And if you do,
it's not
you should be dragged behind a pickup. It's fucking awful.
Your job is to fix it inside.
My hey you also goes out to Prime Minister Trudeau, but it's not backward looking, it's forward looking, literally. In 2 weeks, there's going to be a national convention for the Liberals. Their biennial convention will be held in Ottawa. And I think the Prime Minister should do two things, and suspect he might be only thinking about one. First, he should announce unequivocally and full-throatedly that he is going to be running in the next election. He should settle that question. He should not permit there to be any ambiguity. I'm not convinced there's a lot, but people still talk about it. I think you should say, listen, the deal is I'm running in the next election. That's clear. I suspect he's probably going to plan to do that. But I think that he also needs to talk in very emphatic and I think very specific reasons why he's going to run again. Like, it shouldn't just be, I am running again, that's the announcement. Now let me go through my greatest hits in terms of what we've done and what we are going to do. I think he needs to show the piss and vinegar he showed at the press conference with Premier Ford earlier this week when he invoked Poilievre's name. I think he needs to demonstrate that he views this next election as a referendum on where we're going as a country, what our values are, what we stand for. Turn this thing into a cause celeb, a fight for the ages, and tell people not just that you're running again, but why you're running again. I would do that now. Shut down all this other speculation and nonsense and just close the door on any negative speculation.
Can you really shut the door on speculation when you're behind in the polls? I mean, there's literally nothing that he could say now that would convince me that he's going to run again if he's 12 points down in the second half of 2024.
For sure. Those are, but that's, to me, that's an article of degree. I think, there's almost in Ottawa right now, the sort of salons of Ottawa, it's an open question as to whether or not he intends to run again. And I think he needs to make it clear that he fully intends to run again. And I think when he backs that up with, because here's the fight that gets my blood up, and here's the dunk I want to bring down on top of Poilievre, I think then that will persuade people. And then it only allows for that exception where you sort of look into the abyss on the eve of the election and say, all right, I'm going to pull a Mulroney or a Pierre Trudeau.
Excellent. All right. Well, interestingly enough, my hey you also goes out to the Prime Minister, and it relates to the discussions about what he had to say at the Volkswagen announcement. And listen, somebody's got to start going after Poilievre. Somebody's got to make distinctions. And I like the arguments you were making, and I really liked the passion that you did. And so it probably felt good for you to do it, and it felt good for Liberals to hear you do it. However, going forward, we've been calling for attacks on Poilievre on this show. Scott and I have been, and Jordan to some extent have been calling for attacks on Poilievre, but not from you. You're not the attack dog. You're the Prime Minister. You've got to sell a vision for this country, and you've got to be liked. And it is difficult for people to like somebody who's being negative. So while you've got to lay out differences with Poilievre, don't be the attack dog. Go to Azam and your other campaign staff and say, take what I said and get that shit out there using other methods, but not you. Anyway, good outing. And so thanks everybody for being here. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, our sponsors, CN, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and the Nuclear Innovation Institute. I want to thank everybody who watched and listened, and tune in next week for more Curse of Politics.